Hello and welcome to the Deep State Consciousness podcast. Today I'm joined by Barnaby Adams. Barnaby is a graphic designer by trade with also an interest in and pursuit of spirituality. And as a marriage of those two, he's created something called conscious branding, which he's going to tell us about. Hello, Barnaby. Good evening.
Hello, Rich.
So before we get to this topic of conscious branding, which is something I know very little about, so I'm up for the education. But what started you off as a graphic designer? Is that something you've always done?
Okay. So the honest answer to that is that I'm not particularly academic, but went to a very academic school. And the only way I could make sense of really complex information was to lay it out visually. And so it's a rather sad story, really. But me doing homework involved me like laying the stuff out in a way I could make sense of it. Once I became an adult, other people kind of clearly saw some value in what I was doing, and that escalated into a whole career of trying to make sense of complex things in visual ways.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, because I mean that's the one thing I do know about your work is Barnaby is very good at making things look good. And if anyone's watching this on YouTube as opposed to the audio, you might just notice that the room behind Barnaby just kind of looks good. It looks like things are in proportion and the colours contrast well. You know, it's like, and that's what my experience of Barnaby's work. He can take images and yeah, they always just look good in a way that you can't put your finger on it. Why does that look good? And if I did it, kind of the same thing, it wouldn't. And Barn can explain that sometimes, but that's my observation of it. So, okay, so take us into conscious branding a bit, and you might want to mention how the spiritual thing kind of opened up for you in that and married with this graphic design work.
Yeah. Okay. So let's go with the story, I think, of my little story. Yeah. So I went to university. I learned to be a graphic designer. A whole section of that, really, of my degree was around branding. And when I was at university, so we're going back kind of almost 20 years, it was clear that the lecturers didn't really understand branding very well. They couldn't answer my questions. And you know, so some sort of alarm bells rang. Later, when I worked in the commercial world as a designer, I was working in very much in a corporate kind of position. It became very clear that like directors of huge companies didn't really understand what branding was. Of course, nobody said that. Everyone kind of played the game of nodding and smiling and saying things that sounded right. But it became clear that people, it's like, oh, they don't know what they're talking about. And I did a whole section where I worked as a freelancer. So I was going in and out of design agencies and the likes. And it was clear that my peers didn't really understand what branding was. And, you know, the more honest I got with myself, the more I realized I didn't know what branding was either. And that we were all winging it and everyone was telling a certain story. And the more I analyzed what I was saying, the less true it was. You know, any definition, for example, would fall apart under the tiniest amount of pressure.
Okay, so can you give an example of that? Like, what kind of things would you say or other people say when, okay, Barnaby, what is branding? Or not what you would say now, but back then, what kind of things would you say that didn't work for you?
I think commonly, people will get lost in, you know, the typical one, and maybe this is just because I'm a designer, and so they think, oh, designer, I'll go in this direction. People think of, you know, like a logo is the brand.
Yeah.
That's a very common mistake, really.
Okay.
And of
Probably
course,
what would come to me, actually. Yeah.
Yeah. Language has evolved. What they're thinking of is a brand mark. It's not a brand.
Right.
So that's kind of one area. And then the more I started to explore, yeah, that's where I started. That's where the language takes us. That's where it's come from. But the more you start to look, where people tend to end up, what's typical is you end up talking about values. And when you start asking someone about their brand, what they do is give you this bit of paper with like a list of some fairly random values on it. And that's their brand. And it's like, okay. There's a place for values in the world. I think fantastic, very interesting. That's not your brand. So yeah, they're kind of classics. What I've found in my professional life, since I've been running my own business for the last 10 years, is where I always start with people. It's like, how do you define a brand? And most people cannot do it. They start, you kind of see people confidently start and then start to stammer a bit and go, oh, and then they look to me and go, is that right? And when you're sitting down with directors of huge companies, that's quite interesting.
Okay, so if it's not what I would have perhaps said, the brand image, and if it's not some sort of deeper sense of values that you can write down in the list, how did you come to define brand?
Yeah, so this took a long time. I've gone through many renditions of this, but there are two definitions that I think are very useful, and perhaps they're a bit vague, but they allow me to go somewhere. So my definition now for the word brand is that a brand is an idea, and it's an idea in the mind of the individual, and it's an idea about what something or who someone is. In contrast, branding is anything and everything that informs that idea.
Okay.
So as an idea, a brand exists in the imagination, whilst branding, that exists in sensation. So branding is anything, or a piece of branding is anything that you can see or hear or touch or taste or smell. So what we're doing right now, what I'm doing, you referred to the room. The room through this video screen becomes a piece of branding. And why does it look good? Because I thought it through, and the shirt matches and the you know, it's and the, you know, you go to the website, it all matches, you know, it's that's the game.
But then there's a deeper expression going on there, which is, okay, so that's the tangible branding. So then with your company and with the companies you work for, you develop a brand which is in the imagination less tangible.
Well, what starts to happen, and I think what's interesting is once we can hold those definitions, there's a whole series of insights that arise from that. Where I tend to work with either individuals or businesses, is the first thing I like to do with people is to get into building a brand, and we look at their idea of who they think they are, either as an individual or as a business, and explore that, and then we create lots of pieces of branding, so things in sensation that make that idea feel real, that take something out of the imagination and turn it into tangible things you can see and hold. And more, you know, I want to be now moving on to the conscious branding bit, which is not what that is. That's just branding.
Right,
what I've just described there. That's doing branding with people. And I think it's really beneficial because it sets the ground for where I want to then take them. The key kind of, there's a few elements so if you look at like branding, what you could say is that every piece of branding has four main elements to it. There's form, some sort of form. There's an expression of character or characteristics. There's a story, and then there's a cultural context, so kind of like a bigger story that sits within. And where my kind of trip has taken me is to kind of get down to that, and then to explore how everything is expressing character. Just everything. You know, the room, there it is. Me, my voice, your voice, the tone of voice, the choice of language, the speed I'm speaking at, what I'm wearing, just, you know, the color of my skin, my haircut. Everything is expressing character. And so we can start to see, you know, in that sort of world of commercial branding, we can start to see how everything can become a piece of branding. You know, initially we start by creating things, but then very quickly it becomes clear, well, I can just buy things that express the character. And so people buy things and stand near to them. And so you start to see that the way the idea develops in the mind is through association. I see Richard, but I start to associate you with the room I see behind you. And I start to tell a story about where I think you live, for example. That story starts to form in my mind, and I start to create the brand of Richard. So one of the key then insights where we start moving into conscious branding, which is where it gets far more interesting, is that the insights that come from that is that we start to realize that there is no the brand. So in the commercial world, we talk about the brand of, I don't know, Tesco or Sainsbury's or Asda or, you know, whatever. And we've all got in mind that it's the brand of. But when you start looking and you say that a brand is an idea in the mind of the individual, you can start to see that there is no the brand. There's no one brand. However many people watch this video, that's how many brands of barn there will be within the context of YouTube.
Yes, okay.
So once we start realizing that there's no one brand, you then start looking at what's going on when we look at all the branding that all these companies are creating, or that we as individuals are creating. It's like, what's going on there? We're all individually trying to convince everyone that there is the brand. There's us. One of the places you see this is in social media all the time. So people start to create the image of who they are through being very selective about what they post. Sure. You know, they'll take 20 photos and choose the best one. Cameras now, it's all built into it, but there's a skin filter and they all look a little bit soft and wonderful. You know, they start to tell a certain story. Their digital image becomes what they want the world to see. But of course, that isn't who they are. That's just the persona that's being put out. And so we can start to see that what we're doing in that, right in there, that's all branding at an individual level. And we're trying to tell a story about who we think we are and how we want to be perceived.
So where does that transition to this concept of conscious branding? Yeah,
well, the more conscious we become of what the words mean and of analysing what we're all doing, whether individually or commercially, the more truthful we can be with ourselves, the deeper a question we start to ask. It's like, well, if I'm not who I'm presenting myself as, if my idea is not the truth. So for example, I said everything expresses character. And what happens is it's not just one character. All these elements in my room, they're expressing lots of different characters. And when you bring, or lots of different characteristics, and when you bring them together, what you're doing is creating a personality. So when we start to look through that, and you can see it in the language, so characteristics contains the word character, contains the word actor. Personality from persona, it means mask. We can start to see that our idea of who we think we are isn't who we think we are. Well, maybe it is who we think we are, but it's not who we are. Okay. We create our idea and it exists in the mind. And then often we try and convince other people to share our idea, share what's in our imagination. So in my trip, what I started doing with my own branding is rather than trying to create a story that would convince other people to buy my graphic design service. I started using the creative process to explore what on earth I was doing in the world. And when I first went self-employed, I was very much aware that every time I'd been employed as a graphic designer, either officially or commissioned in some way, I was being asked to create this mask for someone.
Yes.
And it was very clear to me often that I was lying.
Right.
Either I was embellishing the truth, or I was being directly asked to lie. It's like, well, we don't do that, but convince people we do.
Okay.
And often the darker whatever was being done, but the more impressive the image I had to create was, the bigger the budgets would be.
So can you, I don't want to obviously ask you to talk about your old corporate clients, but can you give any example of how someone might use a brand in that environment to present an image that isn't really them? Like I could think of it in politics quite easily.
Yeah, I mean, politics is a very, very easy area to see it, mainly because all politicians are constantly lying. Caution. No real news flash there. I mean, we saw it last summer brilliantly with Theresa May and Jeremy Corbyn, both trying to get elected to be the Prime Minister of the UK. And Theresa May was a classic. I took a great deal of pleasure in watching the branding. So they had a tagline for the Conservative Party, and it was delivered again and again and again. And every paragraph, this kind of line was dropped in. And there was an excellent piece in the newspaper where she was photographed in front of her big bus, and it looked like she was surrounded by loads of people, and she was meant to be addressing the north of the country, according to the headline in the paper. And whilst this had been going on, there was someone else, someone was wandering across this car park somewhere or the other, and they pulled their phone out and took a photo of it from a different angle.
Yes, I think I recall this, yes.
And it was just the people off the bus that had come with her, had huddled round, got in close, and they'd taken a photo. And that's a really good example of how, when you looked at the front of the newspaper, it was cropped in a certain way and it told a certain story. That was part of the branding, and that supported her tagline. I forget what the tagline was exactly now, but change perspective, look from somewhere else, and it was a completely different scene. And of course, now with the joys of social media, the other photo was circulated across the country before the newspapers had even printed, the official photo of it. So, yeah, we see it all the time. Jeremy Corbyn was another classic. I mean, he was just delivered the tagline so many times. It was kind of mad, and he did it. He did it so badly that it was kind of comical. And what you could kind of see with all of it was how the intentionality with it is to indoctrinate the audience. It's like, if I say something enough times, you'll believe it's true. The other place I see it, the great commercial example, is when you're walking around a supermarket. Next time you're in a supermarket, the tannoy will keep coming on, and they'll say, check out, people to check out, like this, get the stuff. And it's always ended with this little tagline. The taglines are always what give it away. It's like, every little helps. And you just hear it again and again and again. There's this repetition. And it's like, if we say it enough times, you'll believe it's true. Okay,
so I'm assuming that the people pay a lot of money to research whether that works or not. And so darkly, is that, the way, if you want to convince the masses to buy your product or go and tick a box next to your name, is repetition rather than integrity what works?
Well, it would appear that way, like you say. I mean, all of the realms of marketing, that's what's going on. All that once you become aware of it now, you'll start noticing it everywhere. That's how you convince the masses. That's how you...
In politics, it's hard to know how effective it is, because you've got really two and a bit parties to choose from here, and they both use repetitive marketing. So it's hard to know if one of them's like, okay, away with all that, we'll connect on a much more genuine level and message. I don't know, maybe they do well, right? Or maybe people don't devote enough mental energy to politics to take something like that in. They just want to hear hope and change. I don't, I don't know.
Yeah.
But well, what's your solution to how do you see conscious branding in your work addressing that kind of repetitive?
Yeah. So, I mean, where I went with my work is I got really stuck with it, because I got to this point where it's like I wanted to brand myself, my own business. It's like, how do I do that then? How do I, knowing all of this, how do I brand myself, my business, what I'm doing? Even if I just say I'm Barnaby Adams, I'm a graphic designer, it's like, what does that mean? What, am I Barnaby Adams, or is that just another label? So what I started playing with was using this creative process to kind of just be playful. And I developed my whole brand. The company's called Cuckoo. And I explored these themes of like trying to fit in and stand out, exploring like the need to get fed and competition and growth. Right. I explored all of these things that I had to do as someone running a business. And I used the analogy of the cuckoo to explore it, because up until that point, I was pretty confident to say that every time I've been employed, I was just being asked to create an illusion for people. Mm-hmm. And so I had all these little illustrations of this, a cuckoo egg in the nest, and the little chick hatching, and then it's sort of shoving the other birds out of the nest, and then it presenting itself as the adult birds wanted it to be seen. Mm-hmm. It's quite I'm a big chick here, I'm doing well, feed me over the others. And of it grown. And eventually you end up with this scene where I've got this little nest and this great big cuckoo, and the parent birds are sort of looking at it thinking, what's going on? And in my mind, what the image represented is the world we've created for ourselves, the commercial world. When you look at the huge corporations and what is really kind of going on in the world in terms of as consumers, we're just feeding and feeding and feeding, and they're getting bigger and bigger, and just destroy anything in their path, really. So the image kind of, for me, represented that. And then my last kind of step where I kind of, in this part of it, is I look beneath the nest. It's like, what's going on beneath the nest? And there are all the dead chicks and all the bird poo, and sort of poisoned landscape, and fairly dark and dismal, and like, oh dear. And it kind of feels like this is where we've come to. What is the future if we continue in an illusion? Yeah. At that point, I kind of got stuck. It's just like, oh, I've entered some very dark place here, and I don't know where to go now. And at that point, I really started exploring the who am I question. And I got into philosophers like Alan Watts was a favourite. And that led me in turn then on to Tim Freak, who, I know obviously you've interviewed many times, and we've been on retreats together and all the rest of it. So, I got into Tim's work, and Tim, of course, was able to answer that question in a way that he takes you on a particular journey and invites you to step out of your idea of who you think you are. Or to use my language, to step out of the brand you imagine yourself to be. Right. And of course, the experience I had on one of these retreats was just absolutely full on different experience, which essentially, it's an experience of oneness and love. That's what, boom. And it's quite funny. I was the guy on the retreat that didn't get it at all. I was like, don't get it. Everybody else seemed to be having a good experience. I was just, and then in the last couple of minutes, all the magic happened. And then everyone kind of rushed off to get trains and planes and stuff. And I was just left in this big retreat house, kind of just there like, whoa, what on earth was that? So what I've been exploring since is to continue on that path and look and see what happens when we bring that experience and the love that arises in that experience. What happens when we bring that through into what we're doing in the world? So know how I said that all branding expresses character.
Mm-hmm.
One of the most important things to understand is that our actions, what we do, is also our branding as individuals and, again, commercially. What companies do is their branding. And what we see in the commercial world often is that a lot of money is spent on PR, which before it was called public relations was called propaganda until that got a bad name. And I forget where I was going with that. What happens when our actions are part of our branding because they inform the idea of who we think we are. And what PR does is when the actions are bad, when it's like, oh no, we don't want people to think that, the PR kicks in to try and divert attention and to try and tell a different story. And this understanding that our actions are also our branding becomes hugely important, because then it's like, okay, so once I know I'm connected to everything that is, I am everything that is, Barn is a branded expression of something that is formless. Mm-hmm. Once you grasp that, and once you experience that visceral love in the body, how do you bring that into your actions, into what you do in the world? So what conscious branding then becomes about is, how do we as individuals, and also as individuals who run or employed by businesses, how do we bring love into the business world? I was rather fascinated to discover that the word commerce comes from the same root word as merciful. So if you go back, there was a time when, I don't know, the Vikings or someone would roll up on the beach and just take what they wanted. And then you get trade, and trade comes in. And by comparison, it's a very loving act, isn't it? It's like, sure, I'll give you some money, or we'll give you some gold or something you want, and you give us what we want, and we'll leave you alive, and we've given you something that's of value to you so that you can keep doing what you're doing, and we'll roll back up next year and do the same again. So we all win. Hooray.
Yes.
So you see that this merciful commerce comes forward, and what I kind of see conscious branding in is like the next step to that. It's like, have you actively say, we're rolling out this sort of illusion because we want people to feed us, and we're trying to do this in the world. And all of that, all the time, once we get lost in that story, it can get very dark and very kind of horrible things go on. And there's a lot of destruction. I mean, environmentally, the Industrial Revolution didn't finish. We just moved the darkest parts of it to the other side of the planet. Mm-hmm. If you go to China, there are huge, vast lakes that are poisoned and all the rest of it, because they're producing plastic and stuff for us to use once and send to landfill. So what conscious branding is kind of becoming conscious of who we really are, and then bringing the love in through what we do. And so how I see the process is that you look at the business, you look at everything it does, the whole, from the beginning to the end of it, you look for where the love is missing, and then you bring the love to that. And then those stories that come out of that, they become the stories through which you promote yourself in the world. They're the stories you invite people to engage in.
Okay, I think we need an example there.
Well, okay, so my own story with the cuckoo is a great example. It's like, here's this guy taking a very dark journey, and then he steps out of his brand for a moment and starts to tell a very different story. The light shines in. So when we look at the commercial world, there are loads of people doing amazing things, new technologies. People, the plastics one is a big one at the moment. There are people saying, look, plastic effectively you're pouring oil all over landfill sites and putting it all in the water. I read a report the other day that said 9 out of 10 bottled waters, this was in America, but 9 out of 10 bottled water have bits of plastic, tiny bits, floating around in the water. So we're consuming that. We're effectively, I was in Glastonbury Abbey the other day, and they've got these pieces of, in the museum, they've got these pieces of lead piping. And this chap, I happened to be stood next to it, and this bloke came up and said, "Oh, imagine if they knew what they were doing to themselves." Yeah. And it's like, well, we're doing that just now with plastic. We're doing this exactly the same thing. We just only just becoming aware of it. So, there are people developing new plastics out of things like vegetable matter, just out of compost. It's amazing. And they're biodegradable. When the whales eat the plastic, they just get a nutritious meal. Hooray. And there's loads of this. Hempcrete is a really interesting one. You can make concrete out of a plant that is so amazing, it can turn radioactive soil into something that's not radioactive.
Okay. I mean, let's accept that's amazing. It sounds amazing.
Yeah.
But they're amazing. They're examples of amazing products, right? And even if they were branded awfully, they'd be amazing products. So where does branding enter into that to tell the story?
The product is part of the branding.
Right.
How could it not be? It's expressing character, and it forms our idea of what something is. Imagine the idea. You see, it comes back to this understanding of what a brand is. Ferrari cars. What would the brand of Ferrari be if it didn't have the car, the product? The product is the brand.
Yeah, be a picture.
Or certainly a piece of branding.
Okay, so how would this kind of concept of conscious branding help? Let's take Hempcrete as one. Maybe take Ferrari as another. I don't know. Where could they potentially go wrong then in their efforts to brand that you could address through the concept of conscious branding?
Yeah. So again, this is challenging stuff now, because what I'm saying is that through telling the story, by creating even just the product, you're beginning to tell a story. And what starts to happen is we're inviting people to buy into the story and believe the story as a certain truth. What I'm suggesting is that we all see that it's just a story, and we step out of all the stories, we meet each other, we see what we're doing, and then we come back in and engage in it in a loving way. So here's a really good example. It's a great example. I saw a product the other day that is designed to remove damp from your house. If you've got mildew growing up the wall in the bathroom or whatever. And all it is bamboo that has been cooked and turned into charcoal. And it's a little, it looks like a sort of a canvassy bag type of thing, full of these burnt tubes, and you hang it up in the room. And apparently, if I believe the branding, if I believe all the testimonials and all the stuff they put on their website, it is a very effective product at solving that problem.
Okay.
So that sounds amazing. And it sounds even more amazing if you consider what the alternative options that generally don't work very well. Spraying chemicals all over the mildew and breathing all that in.
Sure.
In the end, it goes down the drain or whatever. You can get these expensive air circulating devices which burn loads of electricity and all the rest of it. So in theory, this is a great product. Now, it remains a great product if we're growing the bamboo sustainably. But if we go out there and just start hacking down some oriental rainforest somewhere in order to get at it and flog it, there's no love in that. So the challenge is, how do you do it with love? When it then comes to the promotional, what we think of usually as branding, just that, how do I promote it? So they were doing something that I consider to be really unconscious. They had this website that it came up and it had a great big timer. And it said, we're selling these, limited number available, buy now. You know, it was kind of like this. And there's this great big counter. And I immediately start to feel stressed just looking at it. It's like, oh, I really like the product. I really want one. So now they're manipulating me. They're playing on all these kind of visceral reactions we have to being put under the pressure to buy. And so I really didn't like it. And of course, I immediately kind of, it's like, oh, why did they do that to such a beautiful product? Why are you doing it? I'm not going to buy it. And so I sat and I watched and I waited the 6 hours or whatever for the counter to run out. And then immediately a pop-up comes up and it says, we've added another 10 minutes and you can save another $10. You know, it's kind of like this.
So, I mean, when I see stuff like that, I feel it's very disingenuous, and I feel I can spot these disingenuous. I'm saying everyone spots them, but I feel like, you know, when I used to work in the shoe shop many lifetimes ago, and I know, like, so for example, I like the cost of like expensive boots, right? When we'd have a sale, we would say like 50% off. I knew that was like totally disingenuous. They didn't cost £90 to start with. Okay. Yeah. We put them at that price so we could then say 50% off when they were selling for their real price of 45. We didn't expect to sell them at £90. To sell like 2 pairs. So it's just a way of like making people feel that A, they're buying expensive boots, and B, they're getting a really good discount. It is kind of manipulative. And I go through life being wound up by these things. Like when someone releases a product and instantly you've got a 2,000% discount, and so, well, don't be ridiculous. It only costs £10 to start with. It's not whatever that would be, £1,000. You know, and again, I guess it works in some ways.
It does work.
But to me,
that's why they do it, because
I think why would I trust that your product worked now? Because you've just lied to me about, you know.
That's exactly it. They're lying. You know, the promotional branding is lying, which means that, are they then lying about the product? Are those testimonials real? How can I believe anything you're saying when your sales tactic is dark, frankly? So yeah, absolutely. I mean, great examples of the problem. Now, from a business point of view, as someone that runs a business, I also understand there is a need to make sales. Running a business is extremely difficult. And if you don't, you know, you've chopped down and you've burnt all your bamboo and it's all in a little box, or, you know, they've made the shoes, they need to shift them before the fashion changes, or I don't know, they're found out that it's all a crock. They've got to shift units. So this is how we slip into this. And again, the invitation, I suppose, is that there are much better ways of doing it, just being honest. And it may well be that doesn't allow you to shift as many units. But what it does do is attract a like-minded audience to you. And therefore, I suppose what you could see in that is that conscious brand is very much about a long-term game rather than a short-term. If the short-term is just to clear the market stall, get rid of it all and go home, then you wouldn't, you know, trying to engage more consciously is unlikely to give you the most financially profitable result. But if you're interested in the long-term game of developing actual relationship with clients, then obviously not starting the relationship with a lie is probably a good idea.
Yes.
It amuses me when I get a phone call from for example, an Indian or Sri Lankan call center, and I get, you know, some guy on the other end with a thick accent, and he says, "My name's Bob," and it's like, I really doubt that's true. So you've just started the whole dialogue with a lie. It's like, why would you do that? I can cope with a foreign sounding name because I'm probably not going to use it in this conversation.
Just as a sidebar, I always find it funny when Westerners take on, in the spirituality scene, take on Indian names when they want to teach spirituality. So we take on Indian names to gain credibility, and they take on Western names to gain credibility.
A fine insight. So true. And you can see it's Brandon, isn't it? Can you see that?
Totally. I mean, I'm sure some Westerners take on Indian names for very heartfelt, genuine reasons. Okay. I'm also sure that not everyone I'm sure that some of them must be aware that there are commercial implications and potential benefits to doing so. They can't be unaware of that this will affect the number of customers they might have.
No, I mean, what you've just said, it does highlight such an important part there, though. It's like, if you're genuinely doing something really good in the world, when you create your branding and you put that out there, there needs to be an acceptance that you're still creating an illusion. And what I see is that people say, but people get quite upset about that with me, and they're like, well, no, we're telling the truth. That's not a lie. And it's not that it's a malicious lie, but you are creating an illusion. The reason is that you're telling a story about a story. So it's like, you're actually doing something in the world that's happening. And when you write your promotional literature, for example, you're telling a story about it. When I read it, I'm now going to, in my mind, tell a story about your story, about what you're doing. And so you can start to see that anything we say, there's a great line that says, well, all words are lies, or all art is artifice. And it's absolutely true. And so, again, my invitation is if you're doing something really great in the world, of course, you need to tell a story about that. And you should tell a story. The story is really, really important. It's really beneficial, and it helps us direct where we're going.
Yeah.
But don't get lost in the story. That's kind of the key, isn't it? Always know you're telling a story. One of the reasons my business is called Cuckoo is, that's not a great way to sell graphic design. I've got to tell you, saying all of this stuff to people don't want to hear it. But what that name Cuckoo does for me is it keeps me awake, because I fall asleep all the time. I get lost in the story all the time. And I know when I'm lost in the story, because I start acting like a complete arse. What the word cuckoo does is it catches me, and I go, oh yeah, I just slipped in again. There it is. So in my logo, it says Cuckoo, and under it says conscious creative. Well, that's a lie. It's like, I'm conscious for the tiniest little percentage of the day, in reality. But if you buy into that, if you believe it, it's like, well, I did have the word cuckoo above it just to warn you, it's like, believe nothing. And so I think what I'm saying is that we can be playful with it. We have to tell a story, so be playful with the story and don't get lost in it. And I would suggest that we invite others to also see that it's just a story. And I think it feels like that's what the real mission here is for conscious branding, is can we wake each other up through what we're doing? Now, I've taken it to an extreme where I start exploring identity with people and really going all the way. But we can also do that just through developing amazing products or services that are heart-centered and that change the culture by offering something new. I mean, one of the movements that has really interested me has been the veganism thing that's going on hugely. So if you watch, it's like, the marketing departments of the commercial world have gone, oh, there's lots of vegans out there all demanding something. Let's write protein on the front of every box we sell, right, to try and get that part of the market. Okay. But wherever you stand on the arguments around animal product, it's a fascinating sort of exercise in branding. So there's the one extreme of, I've met a lot of very angry vegans, and maybe they're right they're justified in that anger. But what they do is just through their branding, through shouting and banging and all of that, calling for the death of humans, ironically, what that does is just turn people away all the goodness in their message. What I would consider conscious branding is the people that go, okay, I'm really good with food. I understand flavor. I get taste, I understand textures, I know how to do this, I'm, a chef, a cook, whatever. How can I if I've got some issues around how we treat animals, especially in the industrial level at which that's going on, how could I convince people? Well, use your creativity and produce some amazing food and put it in front of me and convince me that there's another way to live. There's another way to feed yourself. And if you do that well and with love, I'm in. I'm there. Come around my house and cook it again. That's conscious branding, because it's completely heart-centered, and there's no shouting and screaming. There's just an offering of something different, and it's that changes culture. And it feels like this is our opportunity. Our opportunity is to within our work, whatever it is that you do in the world, your actions, your branding, to explore that, find where the love is missing, and offer something new and wonderful using your inherent creativity, and importantly, being really courageous to do it. I think that's often the thing. And there's loads of people that are capable, but they're too afraid to risk it.
Okay, I'd just like to pick up again on that theme of illusion, Barn. I think it's very interesting that you say you're creating an illusion, and you're creating an illusion. And I think it's something that I would struggle with. I imagine there's other people that do, because there's a great value placed on honesty, right?
Yeah.
But I know also in any effort to brand, honesty is not just undesirable, but to a certain extent impossible, right? So when I would do some writing, and I want to tell a story about something that happened to me maybe 10 years ago, some sort of conscious exploration or psychological, emotional healing. Okay. And so that's the purpose of writing, like maybe 1,000, 1,500 word article. Okay. It's not a biography where people get to have an exact record of the details of my life in that period. So I will notice that I will take a rather complex story about me, and I'll reduce that slightly so it fits that, because actually, hang on, there was this whole digression went on, which is it relevant? I don't think it's relevant, so I'll cut that bit out, because it's not really possible. Maybe had a little bit of relevance, but it's not worth including so anyway, okay, I'm starting to just slightly change the details, right? And then I notice even coming down to an interpretation or to words, I can make myself look better or worse as I write this. I can make myself look more or less competent, more or less guru-like even. There's all these choices in how I could present myself, and no one of them is really the honest choice, right? And that's something I struggle with. And when I would advertise, or just not even advertise, but write the description of the kind of work I do around transpersonal self-inquiry sessions, well, even that term is a choice of a brand, right? It makes it sound a little bit more mainstream, transpersonal, as opposed to spiritual So there we go. I've just branded in a way that's sort of true, but excludes other options. When I look at people doing this, I think what strikes me is the people, I can see where people are creating illusions, okay? Because of course, if you go to anyone's testimonials page, they'll have their 12 greatest hits up of where, the clients that regrew their limbs or something after 2 sessions,
The best of the bunch, yeah.
The best of the bunch. And I'm aware that they're selectively editing. And also, probably if I get feedback from a client, they're being a bit selectively editing too, because they focus on the stuff that really helped them, So they'll write about how, it really helped them reconcile their relationship with their mother. They won't write, but I still think my father's a bit of a git, Focus on what helped. So I'm aware that there's illusions there too. And I part of me thinks well, gee, if I created stronger illusions, maybe I'd do well. But I also want to give people an accurate picture and say, well, look, this is what you might be in for. You can't expect a miracle in a session, even though it sometimes does happen, So I think even if we look at it as a kind of spiritual process going through the ages, illusion has played a role in awakening. Okay, so you meet a guru. Who do you believe that person to be? right? Now, maybe they're not actually that different from you or anyone else, but to what role does your belief in Jesus or Buddha or Ramana Maharshi affect or enable your ability to walk the path that you believe in the brand, but maybe the brand's not real? So I think that's a question that I have struggled with and continue to struggle with. What is the legitimate role of illusion in spirituality, in branding, presentation, in life? That's a question for me.
Well, I mean, at its depths, and I've got to be a bit careful, I don't know how well I can articulate all of this really. At its depths, we know this thing here, this character called Balm, we know that this is some energy buzzing about in a particular way, and you and I and most other people see this shape and form. But we know that if you look closely with your microscope and zoom in and in and in, there's nothing there. So at the absolute depths, if we couldn't engage in the illusion, we couldn't have this experience. And, you know, from Tim's work, unconscious awareness comes into form in order to have an experience, and eventually in order to become conscious of itself. So it's through creating the illusion, if we use that word, I use that word fairly cautiously, but through creating a particular reality, an image, that there can be an experience and something can come from that experience. So what is it we want to bring into the world, I suppose, is the question. If we are shaping an illusion in order that we can put lots of numbers on a spreadsheet, in order that we can buy into lots of other illusions and buy a big house and tell the world how successful we are, and all of that, of which there's nothing wrong with any of that. You want to do that, that's kind of cool. But if that's the objective, you know, if the objective is to be happy, if we bought into the pursuit of happiness, the great American dream, then it feels like what you get is where we are. You get to a point where we've got lost kind of in consumerism and building grand temples that we all go to on a Sunday, covered in these big logos, and we kind of, you know, we go shopping. That's it. That's the whole trip. 13.8 billion years so that I can, should I buy this tie or that tie? What does this one say about me versus this one? It's like, what is it we really want to bring in? And of course, you know, when we look at Tim's work, well, what is it that all of this trip of life has been about? Well, it's bringing, you know, it's love, isn't it? The whole thing is a journey from unconscious nothingness to love. And I kind of feel that we're saying the same thing here, really. It's like, if I'm completely and utterly honest about every little detail, does that help you bring the love in? And if it doesn't allow you to sell what you do and do what you do in the world, and if what you're doing is really heart-centered, then it's not serving you or anyone else. If the illusion you're creating, yeah, you will be creating an illusion either way. So if you're doing that from a big-hearted place, and you haven't got lost in it yourself, it's like other people will get lost in it, depends how conscious they are. So they're going to get lost in it. So providing the thing that you're then selling them and the process that allows you to do that is heart-centered, then I would suggest that's making the trip possible. That's allowing you to do something good in the world and the love to come in. You know, if I was completely honest, 5 minutes before we started this call, I wouldn't have pushed that table over the massive thumping, really ugly radiator that is against that wall.
Yes, yes.
But I know very well, because I've explored my screen, that if I push it back, I can hide that radiator and you wouldn't know it was there.
It's a very good example, yeah.
So you know, it's kind of like that. Now, is it hurting anyone to know or not that there's a big radiator in the room? It makes no difference whatsoever. So dress it. make it lovely. Why not? That's cool. Is that authentic or inauthentic? Well, it's an irrelevant, so I'm not worried about it. Mainly because what I'm trying to do is bring something beautiful into the world. And will there be dark edges to that? I'm sure, for sure.
Okay.
Bound to be.
So how do we stay conscious? I'm aware that we're probably pushing it for time now, but okay. I just wonder, how do we stay conscious of that? Because I mean, I know this is something we discussed a little bit over the email prior to this talk, is the sense of what is good. Okay, so one person's image of someone that is doing good work in the world is another person's image of someone who's acting against human interests. Okay, so for example, we could say with global warming. Okay, now if you think global warming poses an existential threat to humanity and the wider world, then working and producing branding around getting children to think about polar bears is a noble act. Okay, however, if you think global warming is all hyped up and some scam by the Rockefeller oil family, and it's really threatening the lives of millions of people in deindustrialized countries if their industries are restricted, then that same use of imagery around polar bears becomes sinister.
Yeah.
Okay. You could say the same thing about socialism and capitalism. Whichever one of them you think would serve humanity better, well, then supporting that is good. But your critics think you're bad for doing it. So there's I don't think there's an easy answer to that, but there's got to be.
It's really not. I mean, what I've seen on my particular trip over the last few years, when we first met, I remember a conversation we once had over lunch. I think it was the socialism and capitalism conversation. Oh, right. I saw the world in very black and white. And the more conscious I become of what I'm engaged with and of my own brand, of what I do, the more I see the ambiguity in everything. And I see how my black and white story that I was telling is nonsense. That good and bad, it's just not that simple. And again, I think this is where, again, Tim's paralogical thinking is so important, to see that, whenever I'm banging on in a particular way, I now know to look for the opposite. And, I'll find that's also true. And it's like, oh. And so we hit ambiguity hugely. And absolutely, I don't think there's a clear either or answer to this, because the opposites coexist. Therefore, do we justify what we do in the world with this sort of righteous, but I'm right, ultimately? Or do we, again, always look from a more conscious space with compassion and do the best we can do, given the story we are ultimately telling? Which ultimately we will slip into and get lost into again and again and again and again.
So could you say then that there's a necessity to use illusion to bring yourself into the world, but also a necessity to be a little bit cynical of those illusions and a little bit maybe keeping them in check and not assuming that they are unambiguously good, or that what you're intending is unambiguously good, to have that, as you say, paralogical sense of what's the opposite of what I'm thinking now, what I'm bringing into the world now.
Yeah. I mean, all I can say is what's happened for me, really, which is I experience the whole world now as brands, and I see the whole landscape. I call it the brandscape. I just see everything I see is expressing character, and when I start to see it like that, it reminds me that it's all one thing saying hello in a multitude of different ways. There's a huge multivarious expression of character. And the moment I remember that, I kind of see it through that lens, I find myself hugely compassionate and kind of love-filled. And I step out on the street. It's amazing I haven't been punched yet, because I kind of walk out there and I'm all smiley, and you know, genuinely like, wow, look at this, look at you. And all I can kind of say really is using that energy to do whatever it is we do in the world feels like it would move us forward. I mean, it's definitely moved me forward for sure. So, and I hope it begins to move the people that I work with forward a bit as well. And I just kind of feel that the more we can do that, then let's see where that takes us. But I completely take your point that how do you make a judgment on this? And I suppose it's to do with the outcome, isn't it? Is it creating more or less suffering?
Yeah.
I guess.
And holding that view that, you know, I'm putting all my energy into this, but I could be wrong in part, or in, you know, at least in part, you know, then maybe the opposite opinion to me has, you know, some validity too. Okay.
And of course, what's so wonderful about that, I mean, I remember our first conversation, you know, there's me so lost in brand. It's like, no. and then it's like, oh, now I've got being challenged in that way is great, isn't it? It's like, oh, now I've got to challenge my own story. Well, am I conscious enough to be able to do that? And so it leads to personal growth. And I think this is, again, one of the things that really interests me. It's like the whole commercial world is focused on financial growth and physical growth. Can we do everything bigger? You know, the fact that resources might be running out or whatever, you know, it's all got to be bigger and bigger and bigger. And I hear like coming out of the European Union, you know, the word sustainability is being used constantly. But it's like, well, do you even know what that means? How would you even begin? Take the plastics example. Like, well, in 5 years' time, we'll try and have one aisle in the supermarket with no plastic. It's like, oh yeah, what will the shelves be coated in? Well, plastic. I forget my point. Other than
I think we're at a good place, but I think there's like so much food for thought there for me. It's really been like I came into this not knowing entirely what to expect or what conscious branding meant, and it's been really it's created a lot of things to contemplate in my mind. So perhaps we can talk again sometime, but maybe that's a good place to cut for now.
Yeah, and I'd love to. And I'm very conscious of myself that I'm really, you know, on the trip myself, exploring this stuff. So I swing all over the place regularly. So yeah, it would be great to see where we are at some point down the road.
Great. Thank you very much, Barnaby. See you soon.
Superb.